This evening we're going to be in Genesis chapter 18. Genesis 18. I'm going to go ahead and start turning there. And this is a little different from the many of the other lessons I've done from Genesis. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, the Hebrews author gives the famous exhortation, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it." And this is, I think, most commonly assumed to be a reference back to Genesis 18 and 19, where Abraham in Genesis 18 hosts these three angels, one of whom is actually identified as the Lord himself. But these three angels appear to him, and he hosts them in his home. And then in chapter 19, of course, that the reason for their visit is to announce the birth of Isaac in the coming year, but also to travel down the road to Sodom and destroy it. That's the whole interaction at the end of chapter 18. Well, in chapter 19, they come to Sodom, and they encounter Lot, and Lot hosts them as well. Okay, so we have these two examples, and, both of them, at least at first, don't seem to realize who they are until they reveal themselves to Abraham and Lot. So what I want to do this evening from Genesis 18 and glancing at chapter 19 as well, is to look at some practical aspects of hospitality and what hospitality means. Now, before we dive into Genesis 18, I want to make a note about the word hospitality. In English, we use this word hospitality. And I wish I'd taken a look, because this is the sort of thing that fascinates me, where we get that word. It does have the word hospital in it, which is a little unusual. So I don't really know exactly where it comes from in English. But in the Greek New Testament, the word that is used is just a word that means the love of strangers or of foreigners. So usually when we use the word hospitality in the 21st century, it can be very general. Hospitality can be hospitality to people you know, or hospitality to people you don't know. But I want to make the observation that in the New Testament, every time you see the word hospitality, it specifically refers to actions toward strangers. Now, there are other passages that talk about your attitude toward people you know, toward the brethren. And one example of that is Romans chapter 12, verse 13, which has two statements back to back: contributing to the needs of the saints, and pursuing hospitality. Well, those are two different things. They're not exactly the same. One is toward the saints, the people you know. Hospitality is actually extended to people you don't know, or to strangers. So when we look at the examples of hospitality in the Scripture, they're this kind of action. It's hospitality toward people whom you do not know. And also, before we jump into the text, I want to make another observation, which is that hospitality is very different in our culture than it was in their culture. It was a very ingrained part of ancient cultures because it was. It's not because they didn't have things like inns and, we have hotels, which are a little different from old-fashioned inns. But the inns they had generally, and this was true all the way through the Middle Ages as well, they weren't known as being places of good repute. An inn, I keep trying to say hotel, but an inn was rather dangerous. It wasn't the safest place for you to stay. They were available, but in general, it was better to stay with someone whom you could trust. And so hospitality was much more ingrained in their culture And it was more normal to have people passing through and you just invite them into your home. That's not something that we are as inclined to do today. But I think it's significant that the New Testament does present hospitality as a Christian virtue. And it's not just the hospitality toward people you know, but as I mentioned, toward people you do not know. Okay, excuse me. Now let's take a look at Genesis 18, verses 1 through 8. It says, Then Yahweh appeared to him, to Abraham, by the oaks of Mamre, which is where Abraham lived, while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing nearby. And he saw, and he ran from the tent door to meet them, and he bowed himself to the earth. And he said, My Lord, this is not a statement of his divinity because he doesn't know who he is yet. It's a respectful term. My Lord, if now I've found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And let me bring a piece of bread so that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass on, since in such manner you passed by your servant. So they said, So you shall do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, Hurry, prepare 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make bread cakes. Abraham also ran to the herd and took a tender and choice calf, gave it to his young man, and he hurried to prepare it. And he took curds and milk and the calf which he prepared and placed it before them. And he was standing by them under the tree, and they ate. Very nice little text here. Now, I want from this text to draw out several practical thoughts, very practical thoughts. And I don't want you to think that when we read Genesis 18, everything that I'm putting out here is something that God is specifically requiring of you. The New Testament presents this as kind of the ideal example of hospitality. So I think it's beneficial for us to look and say, okay, if this is what the best quality of hospitality looks like, how can we have the best quality of hospitality? Okay, that's the way I'm approaching this. I'm not saying that just because Abraham does something here means that you are required to do this to every person who walks by your home. That's not what I'm saying at all. So let me be clear about that. I still think there are practical observations. Here in verses 1 and 2, I find this image very striking in my mind, that Abraham's sitting under this tree. Notice it's the heat of the day, so I'm thinking, early, maybe even late afternoon. It's very warm, so he's sitting in a place where there's a great deal of shade, and people are traveling by. It's very hot in this region, I'm sure, and he sees these 3 men, and he runs to go get them. Now, you notice they don't come to him. They're passing by. But when he sees them passing by, he runs to them. Abraham does not know these people. They are strangers. And he is looking for an opportunity to do something, right? They have not asked him for anything. They have not solicited his assistance. He goes to them because he is looking for an opportunity to practice hospitality. I think perhaps this is the hardest part of hospitality, is that sometimes, at least in our culture today, it takes it practically being forced upon us for us to be willing to express it. We are not going to be the ones to invite someone because we happen to notice a need. Rather, it will take them expressing the need first. You see the difference here? They haven't expressed a need to Abraham. They haven't told him we are very tired and we're weary and we're hungry and our feet are dirty and we need all these things. No, Abraham has taken the initiative to go to them. And that's part of what this concept of hospitality is about, that you take the initiative and you look for an opportunity. The idea of loving strangers means that you are happy to welcome strangers into your presence. That is something you seek out, not something that has to be forced upon you in order to happen. That's the first thing. And then verse 3, he said, "My Lord, if now I've found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by." And he continues with his request. Abraham is not afraid to speak up and to invite them into his home. And I think this is awkward. This is a little awkward, right? I mean, you just see someone passing by, and you go up to them, and you invite them into your home. I don't know how well exactly that would fly today. I don't know if that was awkward for Abraham at all. I mean, he's an old man at this point in time, and I think one of the benefits of being an old man is you can get away with a lot of things that a young man cannot get away with. I think people would probably be very worried if I just went up to them and invited them into my home. But maybe if I were old, I don't know. But I think some of you have that advantage. I'm just teasing. I love you all. But he's not afraid of it. He's not worried about how awkward or strange this interaction is going to be. He just doesn't. And I think that's probably what gets us. And the kind of thing I'm envisioning in my mind, because this is probably the most likely scenario where we would express this kind of hospitality, is if someone walks through these doors, it's a little awkward to ask someone if you can take them to lunch. Whether that's out or into your home. That's a little awkward, right? Well, Abraham isn't worried about whether or not it's awkward, because he wants a chance to serve. He wants a chance to do something. Okay, well, it just might happen that if you offer, someone's going to accept. And maybe that's really why we're afraid to ask, is because we're afraid they'll accept. But Abraham asked. And if you look in chapter 19, verse 2, Lot does exactly the same thing. Lot is sitting in the gate of the city of Sodom. These men approach the city, and he goes to them and he says, "Now behold, my lords, please turn aside into your servant's house, spend the night, wash your feet, then you may rise early and go on your way." And notice how this interaction goes differently. They said, however, "No, we will spend the night in the square." Yet he pressed them strongly, and they turned aside to him and entered his house. So Lot actually presses the issue. Now that's definitely something that we wouldn't do. And I think that's probably more because of a cultural thing. It's polite to reject the first time. Then you press, and they say no, and you have to go through this thing 3 times. And if they reject the 3rd time, then you know that they can't. Okay? Well, we don't do that. We're very straightforward. We like a good yes and no. But in ancient and in modern Middle Eastern culture, it was more like that. You have this almost like a haggling thing. You have to say no before you can say yes. So I suspect it's something like that. Anyway, but you see in 18 verse 3, look at how Abraham speaks to these men. He doesn't know them. And we already know that Abraham is a very wealthy man. He has plenty of resources at his disposal in order to help them. And yet, you see, he speaks very deferentially. He speaks humbly to these men. "My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight." Now, that's an odd thing to say to someone who's just passing by. But he's lifting them up in respect. "If I have found favor in your sight, please do not let your servant pass by." He speaks in this very, very humble kind of way. We're going to see this more toward the end. But he is not using this as an opportunity to show his greatness. This is a chance for him to serve. And hospitality should never become a way for you to lift yourself up or to become prideful. It should be a chance to serve. In Luke chapter 14, verses 12 and 13, Jesus makes a really interesting he gives a very interesting instruction to his disciples. And he tells them, if you're going to host a feast, don't invite your friends, don't invite the rich people, don't invite the people who can give you something back because they recognize how wonderful you are. Instead, invite the people who can do nothing in return. The people who are least likely to reciprocate. Because your reward then will be in heaven. And I think that's a good test for yourself, whether you're doing it for the right motives. Are you doing this because you favor that person, or are you doing it because it is the right thing to do? Well, you're not going to invite homeless people into your home if you're doing it as something to lift you up, because you're probably not going to get anything out of it. It might cost you. It might be unpleasant. It's going to take your time. It's going to take your effort. And yet, that's kind of what Jesus describes. People who have nothing and can give you nothing, those should be the highest priority in your mind of people to help and to serve. Because then it shows that you're doing it because it's the right thing to do. Verse 4. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Consider the needs of your guests and be prepared for those things. Have a clean bathroom ready for them to use. That's an oddly specific but practical thing, and I think that's the equivalent here, right? Have a guest room that is ready at any moment, because you never know when a need is going to arise. Have a guest bathroom. Well, I mean, you may only have a limited number of rooms in your house, I understand, but have your house at least ready so that you could invite someone in if you needed to. Abraham is ready for these needs. Now, I think they were a lot more rustic back then, and it probably wasn't as fancy as the way we like to do things. He's fetching a bowl of water for them to wash their feet, and the rest he has available for them is the shade of this tree he owns. I hope we can offer better to folks than resting under a tree in our yard. I hope we can offer better than that. But I think that's kind of the equivalent, is a guest room and a clean bathroom. Have resources available in anticipation of needs your guests might have. Okay. Then verse 5, and let me bring a piece of bread so that you may refresh your hearts, and after that you may pass on, since in such a manner you passed by your servant. So he's not trying to take all of their time. He just wants to provide them for their needs in this moment. Excuse me. And he's ready to feed them. There's a lot to be said about feeding guests. Now, I think this is interesting. I'm going to notice this in a moment. But he says, let me bring a piece of bread. In different languages, there are different words that just mean food. In the Old Testament, when you see the word bread, the generic word bread, sometimes it can mean a literal piece of bread, and sometimes it's just a very generic word for food. As this is not relevant, but I think it's interesting, so I'm going to share this. In Hebrew, the word for bread is lechem, lechem. And in Arabic, the related word is lahm. You see how similar they sound? Lechem and lahm. Okay, well, in Hebrew, lechem is bread. But in Arabic, Lahm is meat. And you see, it's just a generic word for food based on whatever they ate most commonly, because these Bedouins are traveling through, and so they have a lot of sheep and a lot of goat. And so the generic word for food is a word that means meat. For the Hebrews, the generic word for food meant bread. So when he says some bread, he means something to eat, okay? Now, he offers to feed them. But then you see what he actually feeds them in verses 6 through 8. And he goes above and beyond. Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, "Hurry, prepare 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it, and make bread cakes." A seah, according to the footnotes, I don't have a way of checking this, but supposedly a seah is about 7 liters, 7 quarts. So this is 20 quarts of flour. I don't bake much. I'm not a very good baker. I can tell from some of your faces, y'all are bakers. And you can imagine how much cake that is. That is a lot of cake. And they said, we are going to make so much cake so that it won't run out. There's not going to be too little. That's the point here. You're going above and beyond. We're going to make so much cake. Also, then you see in verse 7, Abraham sends he ran to the herd. There's a lot of running because this is urgent. He wants this to all happen very quickly. He runs to the herd and he took a tender and choice calf. You don't just kill your calves. Those are valuable. And he gave it to his young man, and he hurried to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf which he prepared, placed it before them, and he was standing by them under the tree, and they ate. So, man, they go above and beyond in what they prepared. He said, "I'm going to feed you." He didn't say what he was going to feed them. But he gives the absolute best that he can offer. Now, by contrast, well, not contrast as in I think Lot is doing something different, but I don't think Lot is as well-to-do as Abraham is. And if you look in Genesis 19, verse 3, it says, he made a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Unleavened bread is not cake. They got very different meals when they visited Abraham versus when they visited Lot. They get crackers when they go visit Lot. And I don't think that's because Lot is a bad host, but I think it tells us something about his means. He's not as wealthy as Abraham was. And maybe at one time he was very wealthy, but it seems like that's not the case anymore. But they offer what they have. They offer what they have, and it's not really about how nice the food is. It's about the act of doing it. And it's about offering what you do have. Imagine if Abraham, with all his resources, imagine if he's feeding them crackers. I think that would be embarrassing, right? That would be very poor hospitality, because he has the means to do something greater than that. Also, as a side note, I was very surprised to see that Lot feeds them unleavened bread. This is the first mention of unleavened bread in the Bible. I don't know what to do with that, but I noticed that. So in verse 8, he took curds and milk and the calf which he prepared. As far as I can tell, the point here is that if you have guests, you should try to feed them cheese and dessert. And I think most people will be happy if you give them cheese and dessert. And here's your biblical precedent for that. I'm so funny. But then in verse 8, you see, I want you to notice the last phrase here. He was standing by them under the tree, and they ate. Now, they're sitting, right? That's the whole point. They're sitting under this tree. He brings them the food. They're eating. You don't eat while you're standing. You eat while you're sitting. Abraham is standing nearby to serve. He's standing nearby to serve them like a servant. From the beginning to the end, you see that he's very humble about all of this, and he's putting himself in this role of service toward them. And that's why this is such a great example. He doesn't know that this is the Lord himself and a couple of angels. He has no idea that that's what's going on. And therefore, the Hebrews writer says, some have entertained angels unawares. I don't think that an angel is going to come by and visit your home. I don't think that's the point that the Hebrews author is making either. His point is that if you always live this way, if this is just the kind of person you are, you just have this kind of hospitality, you never know what God is going to work through those things. And therefore, you should just always be this way, because it's a good way to be. Throughout the New Testament, hospitality is presented as a very positive quality. It's part of the qualifications for both elders and deacons. And I hadn't noticed this before, but in 1 Timothy, Paul has a forgotten list of qualifications. We always remember the deacons and the elders, and he talks about how husbands should be and wives and older men and younger men and older women, younger women. He also has a list of qualities for widows. And it's a list of qualities to look for if they're under consideration for support by the church. And one of those qualities is that they have been hospitable if that's what they've done with their lives. Are they the kind of people who have been hospitable and full of service? Because you have the resources to do so. And maybe things are different than they were at one time in your life, but that is something that you are still able to do. And so God presents that as something he expects. And he expects all Christians to be hospitable. As we saw in Romans 12, verse 13, that's not just written to the elders and the deacons or the widows. That's written to all Christians. I understand there are cultural distinctions between 21st century America and 21st century BC Palestine. I understand there are differences in the culture. And yet, hospitality is still put forward as a positive quality that God expects from us. And I don't know which of these aspects are most important, except for the first ones. That hospitality it begins, like so many other things in Christianity, it begins in your heart and with your attitude. And Abraham has a servant's heart where he seeks out an opportunity to serve and to help, even when it's people he does not know. And I think that should be very impactful for us, especially knowing that that's really what God has done toward us. That he has invited us to sit at his table with him. That's Isaiah 25, if you want to cross-reference for that. He has invited us to sit at the table with him and to be his guests. And he wants us to be that kind of people as well. If you have any need, please come as we stand and sing.